He was ashamed of his oversized wife until she outsmarted the man who tried to destroy them. The town of Harmony Creek was a whisper in a land that screamed desolation. Dust-choked and sun-scorched, it exuded a pervasive air of suspicion, fear, and a chilling, pious certainty. Here Gideon stood at the altar, a man carved from cynicism and scarred by a past he refused to acknowledge. He stared straight ahead, his jaw a line of granite as the preacher bound him to the woman beside him, Theodora. He didn't see a bride. He saw a gilded cage, a walking mountain of flesh bought to save his family's dirt-poor ranch. His mind flashed to another suffocating room years ago, to the fever that stole his little brother because there was no one to help. That memory had hardened him, had taught him that the world only respected strength you could see. Now he was shackled to what he saw as the ultimate weakness. He was a gunslinger trading his freedom for another man's gold. But as the town elders watched, smug and satisfied, Gideon felt a chill that had nothing to do with fear. It was the woman's unnerving calm, her quiet assessing eyes. They had forced him to marry a stranger they called a burden. But what if she wasn't the one who was truly trapped? The church in Harmony Creek wasn't a house of God. It was a courtroom, and this, Gideon knew with the chilling finality of a spade striking coffin wood, was his sentencing. Dust, fine as ground bone, coated every pew. It hazed the hard afternoon light that slanted through the tall accusing windows, illuminating the grim, pious faces of the townsfolk. They were witnesses to his execution, an execution of the soul. He stood at the altar, a man carved from the land itself, all hard lines and sunburnt pride. He stared at the crucifix on the wall, a twisted thing of iron and agony, and saw a reflection of his own spirit. Beside him, a rustle of silk, a scent of expensive city lilac that felt like a sacrilege in the air, thick with sweat and desperation. He did not look at her. He wouldn't give her that. "Do you, Gideon, take this woman?" The preacher began, his voice a dry drone, another nail being hammered home. He felt his father's gaze from the front pew, a desperate, pleading heat. "You saved us, son. You saved the land." The land. He was trading his life, his name, his future for dirt. For a patch of earth that had been bleeding his family dry for 3 generations. This was the price. This woman. Theodora. The name itself felt heavy foreign, an over-decorated carriage on a muddy, rutted road. She was a presence, an unwelcome gravity that pulled the very air toward her. He had seen her for the first time only an hour before stepping down from the stagecoach. He saw not a woman, but an obstacle, a mountain of expensive fabric and soft, pale flesh that signaled a life of indulgence he could not comprehend. A life of weakness. His mind a traitor flashed back to a different room, small and suffocating with the smell of sickness. He saw his little brother Daniel, frail as a bird's wing, consumed by a fever they had no name for and no way to fight. They had watched him waste away helpless. That memory had forged Gideon's core belief the world was a harsh, brutal place that broke the weak. And this woman, his bride, seemed to him the epitome of a soft, protected existence. To be your lawfully wedded wife, the preacher finished his expectant silence, a new form of torture. Gideon's jaw tightened. A muscle jumped. The silence stretched. From beside him, a voice surprisingly soft and clear spoke her vow. "I do." There was no tremor, no hesitation. It was the sound of a bell ringing in a clear, cold dawn, and it unnerved him more than tears would have. It was the calm of a person who had looked into the abyss and was not afraid. "Son," the preacher prompted, a hint of steel in his tone. Gideon's throat was a desert. He forced the words out, each one a stone in his mouth. "I do." It was done. The chain was locked. The ride to the ranch was a war fought in silence. They sat on opposite sides of the carriage, a chasm of unspoken resentment between them. He stared out at the passing landscape, his prison, and refused to acknowledge her presence. but he could feel her eyes on him, not pleading, not angry, appraising. It was a look he couldn't decipher, and it felt like a violation. He was the one who had been wronged, the one who had been sold. Why did he feel like he was the one being weighed and measured? When they finally arrived, the setting sun bleeding across the sky, his ranch hands gathered near the corral, their faces a mixture of crude curiosity and pity. Another fresh humiliation. Gideon stepped out first, his boots hitting the familiar dirt with a thud. He turned not to help her, but to watch her. It was a small, cruel test. The carriage step was high. He expected her to struggle to need him. Theodora gathered her heavy skirts with a surprising economy of motion. Her hands, when they appeared from the folds of silk, were not adorned with rings. They were plain strong and steady. She navigated the step with a solid, unhurried grace that defied his expectations. She did not stumble. She stood on the ground, her gaze sweeping over the sprawling ranch house, the weathered barns, the vast open range beyond. Her expression wasn't one of a city girl overwhelmed by the wild. It was the focused, calculating look of a general surveying a battlefield. A shiver, unwelcome and cold, traced its way down Gideon's spine. He grunted, turning his back on her. This way. He led her into the house, the home his grandfather had built with his own hands. Every floorboard, every scent of wood smoke and leather was a part of him. Now it felt tainted. He stopped outside the master bedroom, the one his parents had shared for 40 years. He gestured curtly at the closed door. "This is yours." He watched her face for a reaction. A flicker of hurt, a flash of anger. He saw nothing but that same unnerving, placid calm. The rest of the house, he said, his voice low and hard as iron as mine. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving her alone in the deepening shadows of the hallway. He didn't see her hand lightly trace the carved wood of the doorframe. He didn't hear the soft, weary sigh that escaped her lips once he was gone. He just walked, his boots echoing in the empty hall, heading for the barn, the only place he still felt free. They had forced him to marry a stranger they said was a burden. But as Gideon slammed the barn door shut, plunging himself into the familiar dark, a terrifying question began to form in the back of his mind. In this gilded cage, who was the prisoner, and who precisely was the warden a month past? Not in a blur, but in a series of slow, agonizing days, each one a silent battle. Gideon worked the ranch until his muscles screamed, and his hands were raw, seeking a physical pain to drown out the gnawing humiliation that lived in his house. The vast open range was his escape. The home his grandfather built was now her territory. He slept in the barn, the familiar sense of hay and horsehide, his only comfort choosing the company of beasts over the woman who wore his name. He told himself he was ignoring her, but he noticed things. Small things like splinters under the skin. He returned to the house late one evening, exhausted and grimed with the day's labor, to find a lamp burning in the dining room. Theodora sat at the great oak table, a place she never used, and spread before her were the ranch's ledgers. His ledgers. A hot, proprietary anger flared in his chest. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice a low growl from the doorway. "Those are private." She didn't startle. She simply finished a line of calculations before looking up, her gaze as placid as a deep, still lake. "I'm looking at our assets, Gideon. Or rather," she amended, her voice soft but precise, "our liabilities." She gestured with a pen to an open page. "This supplier, for instance. For the last 2 years, we've been paying nearly 20% more for winter feed than any of your neighbors. Your father marked it as a clerical error. An error that has repeated itself every quarter." He strode over, snatching the book from her. He saw the numbers, the damning, undeniable truth of them. It was a leak, a slow bleed he'd never even seen. He felt a flush of shame quickly masked by defiance. "It's a mistake." "Happens. A mistake that has cost this ranch the price of a new bull every 6 months," she replied evenly, her eyes holding his. "Mistakes like that are how families lose their land. He slammed the ledger shut, the sound echoing in the silent house. I'll handle my own accounts. But he couldn't unsee what she had shown him. Was his father simply a poor businessman, or was this something else? The question lingered a poison in the well of his certainty. The well. A week later, the main pump sputtered and died. It was the heart of the ranch, the mechanism that drew life from the earth to water their herd. Without it, in the unforgiving August heat, their cattle would be in peril within days. Gideon and his two best hands men who could fix anything with wire and grit spent a full day wrestling with the iron beast. They emerged at dusk, covered in grease and frustration defeated. The next morning, as Gideon prepared for a long, arduous ride to the next town for a mechanic, he saw her. Theodora was by the silent pump, her fine dress protected by a canvas apron. In her hands were not knitting needles, but a wrench and a diagram she had sketched on a piece of paper. He scoffed, turning away in disgust. The absurdity of it, but when he returned from the near pasture at noon, a sound reached him, a steady, rhythmic, life-giving pulse. Thump, 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 thump. The pump was working. Water, cool and clear, gushed into the trough. He found his foreman Jeb staring at it with a look of dumbfounded awe. How Gideon asked the word catching in his throat. Jeb scratched his head. The missus. She fixed it. Said a pressure valve was seated backward from the last time it was repaired. Said the schematic was obvious if you just looked. Jeb spat a stream of tobacco. Never seen nothing like it. Gideon stood frozen, the sun beating down on him. A pressure valve. A simple, logical problem he had tried to solve with brute force. His pride, the very bedrock of his identity, felt a deep, seismic crack. He felt a wave of something he refused to name, admiration, immediately followed by a hot, bitter resentment. She was making him look a fool on his own land. It was 2 days later that a rider appeared on the horizon. Not a dusty cowboy, but a man on a magnificent black stallion dressed in a tailored suit that seemed to repel the dust of the trail. He rode with an easy arrogance, his smile as bright and cold as a newly minted dollar. Gideon, a pleasure. Lysander Croft, the man announced, dismounting with fluid grace. I've just acquired the old Miller place to the north. I believe that makes us neighbors. He was charming, his words smooth as polished stone. He spoke of progress, of bringing new investment to the territory. Gideon found himself disarmed by the man's confidence, tempted, when Croft made a generous cash offer to buy a small, unused parcel of his land to straighten out the property lines. It was an easy way to solve the debt her dowry hadn't quite covered. From the porch, Theodora watched her hands still, her face unreadable. That evening, she approached him as he cleaned his rifle in the lamplight. That man, she said, her voice low, cutting through the quiet. Croft. What about him? Gideon snapped, not looking up. He doesn't want to be your neighbor, Gideon. He wants to be your landlord. He finally looked at her, his anger flaring. And what would a woman from a Boston drawing room know about men like him? He's a businessman. He sees an opportunity. I know the look of a predator, she insisted, her gaze unwavering. I have seen it in rooms far more civilized than this. His smile never once reached his eyes. Gideon stood, his shadow looming over her. Her insight felt like another intrusion, another judgment on his world, his competence. You will stay out of my business, he said, his voice cold. I run this ranch. I make the deals. Your part in this arrangement was paid in full at the altar. Do you understand? She held his furious gaze for a long moment, then gave a single, almost imperceptible nod and retreated to her room. He was left alone with the smell of gun oil and the echo of her words. He tried to dismiss them, to cast them aside as female hysterics. But as he stared into the polished steel of his rifle, he couldn't shake the image of Lysander Croft's hungry eyes or the chilling certainty in his wife's voice. For the first time, Gideon considered the terrifying possibility that the greatest threat to his land wasn't drought or disease, but a poison he had willingly invited to his own front door. The rider came at dawn, a silhouette of ill omen against a sky the color of a fresh bruise. He wasn't a cowboy. He was a clerk, smelling of city ink, and carrying a weapon Gideon didn't know how to fight a crisp, sealed envelope. It felt alien in his hand, too light to be a threat, yet heavier than a loaded gun. Inside the paper was thick the words, a forest of legal jargon he couldn't navigate. But the map attached was a language he understood perfectly. It was a knife aimed directly at the heart of his land. Lysander Croft was laying a legal claim to the northern pasture, the pasture with the deep grass, the pasture with the Cottonwood Creek, the only reliable water source for 100 miles. It was a death sentence delivered with a polite, damnable signature. A pure, white-hot rage, clean and simple, surged through Gideon. This he understood. This was a fight. He turned from the door, his spurs ringing with sharp intent on the floorboards, and strode toward the peg where his gun belt hung. "You will not." The voice was quiet, but it filled the space, a wall of sound he ran straight into. Theodora stood in the archway to the dining room, her posture unwavering. She wasn't pleading, she was commanding. "Get out of my way, woman." He snarled, his hand closing around the worn leather of his holster. "And do what she challenged, her eyes flashing with a fire he'd never seen before. Ride to his front door and get yourself shot, or arrested for trespassing, Gideon. That is precisely what he wants. He is not a rancher settling a dispute. He is a spider, and you are about to charge headfirst into his web. I know how to handle men like him." The words tasted like a lie, even as he spoke them. "No," she said, stepping forward, her presence suddenly formidable. "You know how to handle cowboys who fight over cards and cattle. He is not a cowboy. He is a different kind of predator, one who kills with paper and ink, not with bullets. Let me see the papers." He stared at her, his rage warring with the cold, unwelcome voice of reason in his head. She was right. He knew she was right. To ride out now would be a fool's errand, a satisfying blaze of fury that would end with him in a cell or a grave. He was a bull, and Croft was waving a red flag, leading him toward a cliff. With a curse that tore from his throat, he ripped the papers from the envelope and threw them onto the dining table. One day he seethed his finger, jabbing in her direction. "You have one day to play with your city tricks. Then I handle this my way." He expected her to flinch at his tone. She didn't. She simply walked to the table, her expression one of intense, focused concentration, and picked up the document. That night, Gideon couldn't sleep. The barn felt less like a refuge and more like a cage. He found himself drawn to the main house, standing in the shadows of the porch, looking in through the dining room window. A single lamp cast a golden circle of light, and in its center was Theodora. She had gathered his father's old deeds, territorial survey maps, brittle with age, and the ranch's financial ledgers. They were spread around her like a general's battle plans. Her brow was furrowed, her lips set in a thin line. Her pen scratched rhythmically across a notepad, the small sound a stark counterpoint to the vast, sleeping silence of the prairie. He watched for hours as she cross-referenced dates, traced property lines with her finger, and compared the flourishing signature on Croft's claim to the one in the county registry book she must have acquired. He was watching a mind at work, a relentless, disciplined intelligence that was as foreign and powerful to him as a steam locomotive. He had seen her as a soft, useless thing. But this was a kind of strength he didn't possess. A cold knot of confusion and a strange, grudging awe tightened in his gut. The next morning's sun brought fresh disaster. Jeb met him at the barn door, his face grim. "Boss, you better see this." Overnight, a 50-yard section of the northern fence had been cut. A dozen of their best heifers were gone, scattered to the winds. But that wasn't the worst of it. They rode to the Cottonwood Creek and found what he knew with a sickening certainty they would find. A crude dam of rocks and fallen logs choked the waterway, diverting the life-giving flow into a gully that ran directly toward Croft's new property. The water level in their own creek bed was already dropping. It was a thief in the night, a declaration of war without a single shot fired. "I'll kill him," Gideon whispered, his voice shaking with a rage that was now mingled with the cold chill of impotence. He and his men spent the morning tearing down the dam, their hands bleeding from the rough logs and sharp stones. But the work felt hollow. They couldn't prove who did it. There were no tracks to follow but their own. They were fighting ghosts. He returned to the house at midday, defeated, the dust of failure clinging to him like a shroud. He walked into the dining room, ready to tell her that her day was up, that it was time for his way now, however doomed it might be. Theodora was still at the table, exactly where he had left her. But the maps and deeds were now stacked in neat, orderly piles. The lamplight from the night before was gone, replaced by the hard, clear light of day. It illuminated her face, and he saw that the look of weary concentration had vanished. In its place was the glint of sharpened steel. He stopped in the middle of the room, the bitter words dying on his tongue. She looked up at him, her eyes holding his. "They're bleeding us dry, Gideon," she said, her voice a low, steady hum. "Just as I said they would." She didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't have to. She slowly, deliberately reached out and tapped a single spot on one of the old yellowed survey maps. Her finger rested on a small, almost invisible notation marking an abandoned prospector's claim from 50 years prior. "A snake, no matter how clever, always leaves a trail," she said, a small, dangerous smile touching her lips for the first time. "And Mr. Lysander Croft, for all his fine clothes and fancy lawyers, has been very, very careless." She looked up at him, her eyes shining with a brilliant, predatory light. "He thinks he has us in a cage, Gideon. But he has forgotten one thing." She paused, letting the silence hang between them, a silence now filled not with resentment, but with a new, terrifying hope. "He forgot to ask what happens when you lock a wolf in with the sheep. Lysander Croft's final move was not a midnight raid or a hired gun. It was worse. It was a piece of paper delivered by the town sheriff himself, whose face was a mask of pity and professional duty. An injunction. A legal strangulation. The words swam before Gideon's eyes, a tide of impenetrable jargon, but the meaning was as clear and cold as a winter grave. He was legally barred from selling a single head of cattle at the upcoming town auction. The auction had been his last desperate hope, a chance to raise enough cash to pay his men to hold off the bank, to breathe for just one more season. Croft had not just cut his fences, he had severed his lifeline. That evening, Gideon walked the land as the sun died, the sky bleeding out in shades of violet and despair. This was it, the end of the line. The weight of his failure was a physical thing, a stone in his gut. The pride of his father, the sweat of his grandfather, all of it turned to dust, stolen not by force of arms but by the spidery scratch of a pen. He was a fighter without a fight, a man of strength rendered utterly impotent. He had promised to protect this land, and he had failed. He entered the house through the back door, his footsteps heavy with defeat. The lamplight from the parlor cast a warm, gentle glow, a mockery of the cold darkness in his soul. He found Theodora seated by the fire, not with her maps and ledgers, but with one of his own torn work shirts in her lap, a needle and thread moving with quiet, rhythmic precision in her hands. The simple domestic act was so at odds with the ruin facing them that it almost broke him. He stopped before her, his hat in his hands. The anger was gone, burned out of him, leaving only the cold ash of resignation. "It's over, Theodora," he said, his voice flat, hollowed out. "Croft has won. The injunction. It's done. The bank will foreclose before the month is out." He took a breath, the air tasting of dust and failure. "There's a stagecoach that passes through on Friday. You should be on it. Go back to Boston. Go back to your own world. There's no reason for you to be ruined along with me." He had expected her to agree. He had expected relief, perhaps even a flash of triumphant pity in her eyes. It was after all the escape he was offering. He was releasing her from the bad bargain, from the uncivilized husband and his failing land. Theodora slowly folded the shirt she was mending, setting it carefully aside. She looked at him, her gaze not pitiful, but fiercely, unnervingly alive. "You are a rancher, Gideon," she said, her voice a low, resonant hum. "When a wolf has you cornered, do you simply lie down and offer at your throat, 'This is not a wolf. It's a ghost I can't fight'?" He shot back a spark of his old fire, returning. "It's the law, no," she corrected him softly, rising to her feet to face him. "It is not the law. It is a man abusing the law. There is a difference, and it is a difference we are going to teach Mr. Croft." She crossed to the great oak table and unrolled the old survey map, the one she had studied with such intensity. Her finger, firm and certain, landed on the small faded notation near the headwaters of the creek. "He thinks his claim is built on solid rock," she began, her voice taking on the cadence of a lawyer presenting her final argument. "But his foundation is sand. This mark, an abandoned silver claim from 1842, predates the territorial land grants that created this ranch. That small parcel of land, including the source of the creek, was never legally part of your father's deed, nor was it part of the land Croft acquired." Gideon stared, his mind struggling to keep pace. "Then who owns it?" "No one," Theodora said, a triumphant light dancing in her eyes. "Legally, it is undeeded federal territory, which means when Lysander Croft built his dam, he wasn't diverting water from a neighbor. He was illegally seizing a federal waterway, a crime far more serious than a local property dispute." A dizzying, impossible hope began to dawn in Gideon's mind. "But how do we prove it? I have already taken the liberty," she said, pulling a sheaf of letters from a drawer. "I have been in correspondence with Territorial Marshal Kane, a man with a reputation for integrity and a deep dislike for powerful men who believe they are above the law. I have sent him my findings along with copies of the original deeds and land surveys." She held up a sealed telegram. "He is on his way. He agreed that my evidence is compelling, but he needs to witness the crime himself. He needs to see Croft publicly assert ownership over that dam in front of witnesses." Gideon's gaze shifted from the letters to her face. The auction. He breathed the pieces of her insane, brilliant plan clicking into place. "The auction is not for selling cattle," she confirmed, her lips curving into a dangerous smile. "It is a stage, a public performance. Mr. Croft will be there expecting to gloat over your ruin, and we will give him the grandest stage imaginable to declare his victory, and to confess his crime to a federal marshal." The sheer audacity of it left him speechless. It was a plan built on paper and whispers, on law and nerve. It required him to put aside every instinct he had, to fight to rage, to meet force with force, and instead to perform. To play the part of a broken man. To trust her. Completely. He looked at her truly. Looked at her not as a burden or a curiosity, but as an astonishing, formidable force of nature. The woman he had resented for her softness was proposing the most ruthless gamble he had ever heard. She saw the war in his eyes, the doubt struggling against the burgeoning hope. She stepped closer, her voice dropping, becoming a quiet, urgent plea. "He has beaten you at your game, Gideon. Now you must let me beat him at mine. I cannot do it without you. I need you to stand with me, to play the part, to be the shield while I wield the sword." She held his gaze, her own, fierce and unwavering. "So I ask you again, rancher, will you ride with me on this?" The question hung in the charged silence of the room. The entire future of his world, of his family's legacy, of the man he was and the man he could become, rested on his answer. The day of the auction dawned hot and breathless. The air in the cattle yard was a foul cocktail of dust, manure, and judgment. The whole town had gathered to watch Gideon fall, their whispers a rustling, venomous wind. He stood beside the auctioneer's block, playing his part as the broken man, his entire world staked on a woman's mind and a desperate, intricate gamble. Across the yard, Lysander Croft watched him, a smug smile on his face, savoring the humiliation. The auction began, a hollow mockery of a sale. The auctioneer called out the first lot of prime cattle into a dead, expectant silence. They all knew about the injunction. This was not business. It was a public execution. Croft, unable to resist his moment, hoisted himself onto a flatbed wagon. "Friends," he boomed, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "It is a sad day when a legacy like this falls on hard times. But the law is the law." His eyes, glittering with malice, found Gideon. "And let it be known, so there is no confusion, that all water rights to the Cottonwood Creek from its headwaters down are now under my sole and legal proprietorship." He had confessed. He had sprung the trap on himself. Then a voice, calm and caring, cut through the yard from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Mr. Croft, I find your interpretation of federal waterway law fascinating." A man in a dusty coat stepped from the crowd. He flipped back his lapel, revealing the silver glint of a star. Territorial Marshal Kane. "I believe you and I need to discuss that dam of yours." A collective gasp swept through the onlookers. Croft's face went pale. Before he could form a word, Theodora moved forward, a leather portfolio in her hands. She was no longer a silent bride, but a vision of pure, cold power. "Marshal," she said, her voice ringing with clarity for all to hear, "if I may." She didn't accuse. She simply dismantled him with facts, laying out maps and deeds on a barrelhead. "Here is the original 1842 survey map showing the unclaimed federal land Mr. Croft illegally seized. And here," she continued, her logic irrefutable, "is his own fraudulent deed. His entire claim is a criminal act." The crowd was rapt silent. Croft's face contorted in a mask of feral rage. He had been played exposed and utterly humiliated. "It's a trick," he roared, gesturing to his two largest thugs. "Seize those papers!" The men lunged. But Gideon was waiting. He moved with a cold, fluid purpose. He met the first man's charge not with a punch, but with a sharp turn of his hip, sending the man crashing into a fence post. His foreman, Jeb, materialized and disabled the second man with a single, brutal swing of a walking stick. It was over in seconds. A precise defensive action. Gideon stood breathing hard, a human shield before his wife. Marshal Kane had his pistol drawn. That's enough. He moved, in the snap of his handcuffs on Croft's wrists echoing like a gunshot in the stunned silence. As Croft was led away, sputtering threats and curses, Gideon's gaze found Theodora's. She was calmly gathering her papers, her expression serene. Their eyes met across the dusty yard, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. The world had just been saved. And he hadn't had to fire a single shot. He just had to do the one thing he thought was impossible. He had to trust her. The dust settled. The marshal was gone, taking Croft and the wreckage of his ambition with him. The townsfolk had dispersed, their whispers now of awe and disbelief rather than scorn. The setting sun bathed the ranch in a soft golden light, a painter's stroke of forgiveness across a wounded landscape. Silence. A new kind of silence. Not the heavy, resentful quiet of before, but a vast, open stillness filled with unspoken possibility. Gideon and Theodora stood on the porch of the house that was for the first time truly theirs. He watched her, not her shape or her shadow, but the woman herself. He watched the way the fading light caught the intelligence in her eyes, the quiet strength in the set of her shoulders. He had been a blind man, and she had given him sight. His voice, when he finally spoke, was rough, torn from a place of profound, humbling shame. "I was wrong." She turned to him, her expression patient, waiting. "About you," he clarified the words, clumsy, painful. "About everything. I saw this marriage as a cage, a humiliation." He looked out at the land, his land, the land she had saved. "But I was the one in the cage all along, trapped in my own damn pride, my own bitterness." He finally met her eyes, his own raw, with a truth he could no longer hide. "I am sorry, Theodora." She held his gaze for a long moment, and in her eyes he saw not triumph, but a deep, shared understanding of old wounds. "We were both in a cage of a kind, Gideon," she said softly, her voice a balm on his raw spirit. "The world is very good at building them for people like us. I am just grateful we found a way out. Together." A fragile bridge formed between them in that moment, built not of passion, but of something far stronger, mutual respect. He knew he had to offer her the one thing he had denied her from the start. A choice. "The deal is done," he said. "You're free. You can go back to Boston. Your money is your own. You don't have to stay here." Theodora smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that transformed her face. It reached her eyes, and for the first time Gideon felt their warmth. "Go back," she mused, "and miss all the work that needs to be done." She walked to the edge of the porch, her gaze sweeping across the property with a creator's eye. She pointed toward a fallow field near the newly liberated creek. "Do you see that pasture? That land's no good," he said automatically. "Sour soil. My father tried to grow hay there for years." "Your father tried to force it," she corrected gently. "I've been reading about crop rotation, planting alfalfa to return nitrogen to the earth. We could enrich that soil and in 2 years double our grazing capacity." She turned back to him, her face alive with ideas. "It is a new science, a new way of thinking." Gideon stared at her then, at the worthless piece of land. She saw potential where he had only ever seen failure. She saw a future where he had only seen a dead end. He looked at her, this brilliant, resilient, astonishing woman, and a final profound realization settled over him, quiet and true as the rising stars. The richest land on the Circle G wasn't the northern pasture with its deep grass or the fields he plowed. It was the woman standing right beside him.